Well, we're talking end times. Thank you so much for joining us in this series of the Gospel of Mark, where we've come to chapter 13 of Mark, which is kind of an end times prophecy prediction chapter. And so I thought, let's take some time and wrestle through these big ticket items and come at it from a vantage point, as if a person was a new reader and they didn't have all of this other information sort of front loaded with reading prophecy. But they just come to this and they start asking some of these questions. They're reading this chapter and they're like, whoa, there's so many good things in here. And there's so many questions I have. What is Jesus even talking about? And then how do you get spin-offs of those rabbit trails and where do you find the answers? Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew. Thank you for continuing to join us. And I pray that you'll stay with us in these sessions, at least, for this idea of prophecy. So we're approaching this end time conversation as though we're a first time reader, and we've answered some really good questions. So are there parallel passages? Yeah, there are. These lessons are going to build on themselves, and so I really hope that you'll go back and read. This is session 13-3, so I hope you'll go back and watch 13-1, 13-2, and stay right with us because we're going to build on our information and our education as we walk through this. So, are there parallel passages? Important question. The answer is yes. This is called the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples. And you can find it in Matthew 24, here in Mark 13, and in Luke 21. And last time we talked about the prediction and the fulfillment of the temple in Jerusalem and how life-changing and paradigm-shifting that was. Now we continue to read this account in all of the passages, again, the Olivet Discourse, which is in all three Gospels, and we see a change, a scene change. Jesus seems to predict the destruction of the temple while standing in front of the temple, but it also seems like some other things are in view as well. Now all of a sudden we're in verse 3 of Mark 13 and Matthew 24. It's a little different verse in Luke 21. But now all of a sudden the scene is different because we're at the top of the Mount of Olives, which is actually just beside the walled city of Jerusalem to the east. Okay, so we're taking our time, we're going through context here. So they've left the temple in Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem. They've left the temple where this part of the conversation had happened, and they exit the walled city. They go through the gate, they go down through the Kidron Valley, which is a valley that separates the Mount of Olives to the east and Jerusalem to the west. And they go up to the Mount of Olives, and now they're looking over the city of Jerusalem, which even today, it's a beautiful view. You go up to the Mount of Olives, you can see down through the Kidron Valley, and you have this amazing view. Lots of pictures are coming from the Mount of Olives when you see sort of a panoramic view of the city of Jerusalem, even today. So that's where they are. They're on top of the Mount of Olives, looking over the city of Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, the rest of these predictions begin to happen. And this setting on the Mount of Olives is where the whole rest of the chapter will happen, where Jesus is talking with his disciples. But there's a couple interesting things to take note of right away. It is here that the disciples ask Jesus for some help with his statements back at the temple. But if you remember, they were just saying, look at these beautiful buildings in the temple, or these amazing stones of the temple. And Jesus says, yeah, they're all going to be torn down. Okay, then we sort of move on. But now here they are. As he was sitting, we read in Matthew 24, again, Matthew's a little bit more detailed. Matthew 24, verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately and they said, tell us, when will these things, plural, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's not necessarily related from what we have in text. They're not exactly related together. So there was a much deeper and richer conversation that took place in front of the temple. You see what I'm saying? And so now here they are. They're coming to Jesus privately, because when he talked about the destruction of the temple, just in that brief sentence, he wasn't talking about his return. He's there. He hasn't left yet. He's not talking about his return or the end of the age. So where's all this coming from? We know then that there's a lot more in view. We sort of have the Cliff Notes version of conversations that took place. And so Jesus and the disciples, or Jesus's teaching, must have been quite a bit longer, where he said all these different things. And then we're brought up to speed by the account in Matthew, Mark, and Luke of the Olivet Discourse, where they're saying, okay, when are all of these things going to happen? Plural. When are these things going to happen? And what are the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? So a future event is clearly in view. And sort of the end of the age is clearly in view from the perspective of the disciples as they're asking Jesus about this. You see that? So context is key. We take it one step at a time. The end is in view here. And so Jesus begins to answer them. And we have to keep in mind as we go through the whole rest really of chapter 13 and Mark 24 and Luke 21, that there are at least these three questions in view, probably more. Okay, there are at least these three questions in view, but there's probably more about whatever they talked about over at the temple. And that Jesus, sometimes, we have to keep this in view too, that sometimes Jesus shoots straight, like he did with the temple. Yep, these stones are going to be torn down. 70 AD, the destruction happens, the temple stones are thrown down. And sometimes he speaks in allusions, and sometimes he speaks in images. We have to keep all of that in mind as we continue to read chapter 13, and really as we read scripture and prayerfully consider what are we being taught? What are we learning from this passage? And so let's see what Jesus has to say about the end. It's not a insignificant detail that Jesus starts by saying, be careful that you're not misled. He will actually say this a lot in the Olivet Discourse. Don't be misled, don't be deceived, don't be tricked. There will be many false Christs, many false saviors, many people who come saying they're in my name, but they're really not in my name. And then he says that there will be many people who say they're coming on my behalf, they're not. And then he gives a list, future from where he is sitting, again, early 30s AD, sitting on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. He gives a list, future from where he and the disciples are sitting. And he says, you're going to see and hear about wars, rumors or threats of wars. Don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. This stuff has to happen. He's going to say nation's going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines and earthquakes in various places. But then he's going to say, with all of this, but the end is not yet. You hear that? The end is not yet. So keep that in mind. We have to keep that sort of like with a grain of salt. You know, I'm listening, but I'm going to sort of season it out, weigh it out. Keep that in mind that when people read the newspaper and they watch the news and they say, oh, this bad thing is happening, or this pandemic is happening, or this stuff is happening, so the end is here. Because Jesus said these are a sign of the beginning of birth pains. So we got to keep that in mind. We've got to always chew on that a little bit. It could be, but we've got to keep that in mind in what Jesus was saying. And he gives a very interesting and important image of all of this. Mark 13:80 says, after all of this stuff, these are the beginnings of birth pains. Man, that's an interesting picture, isn't it? So the image here that he presents us with is this idea that just like when a woman begins to go into labor, the pain, the stresses, the contractions begin, but they're farther apart, right? And then as you get closer to the actual birth of the child, then the frequency and the intensity of the contractions and the pain increases, right? Isn't that true? Ask any lady who's had a child before. And so I think that's the image that Jesus is painting here. I'm giving you a list of all of these things. And again, we have the Cliff Notes version, but we have a list of all of these things to look out for. And he says the end is not yet. These things are just an indicator of the beginning of birth pains. And so war, fighting, famine, earthquakes, people misleading, others as false Christs or false saviors, these things represent the beginning of birth pains, and they point us towards the end of the age. And according to this image, they should increase in frequency and they should increase in intensity as we get closer to the end. Does that make sense? It seems like that's what Jesus is saying here. Here's the list to be on the lookout for. I'm going to liken it unto birth pains. Now, if we're just honest, this is where it gets a little bit messy. I mean, this whole list, as we look back through the history of the world, and then we're asking, is it more or less? It's a little subjective, isn't it? I think that becomes a little bit of the difficulty. I mean, how much is a lot or a little when it comes to wars, famines, earthquakes, and other natural disasters? It's rather a subjective question to say, are we in the height of the contractions right now, the frequency and the intensity? Or maybe this just represents the beginning and there's more to come. We don't know because we don't know what is to come. So it seems like it's a subjective question, and that's where it can get a little bit messy. I hope that even just helps sort of clarify some things as to why people view things differently around the world within Christianity and Christendom and prophecy, because it's a little bit subjective on how we look at it. And that's something that you'll have to decide and prayerfully consider to continue to study about. Are we at the height of the contractions or not? You'll have to consider that and pray about that. But it seems worthy to note and to consider, at least on the table of discussion, I should say, on the table for discussion, it seems worthy to consider the fact that the 20th century is unprecedented in the loss of human life around the world, considering World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, not to mention many other wars and genocides and the loss of life under communism and dictatorships. That's worth at least considering. So, have the last 100 to 120 years seen a dramatic uptick in the birth pains, in intensity and in frequency? Or perhaps they just represent the beginning of birth pains and sorrows. So as we wrap up today, I hope that you will chew on that for a while as you can continue to read and to study your scripture. Continue to read the Olivet Discourse in all three Gospels as we move forward. Now, the next few things that Jesus will say are so provocative and so interesting. I hope that you'll stay with me as we unpack these things, because, man, the Olivet Discourse is interesting and it seems to only get deeper as we go. Jesus gives us warnings and predictions about the end. So stay with us. We'll see you next time.